With me today on Brief Encounters is Alex Hamilton, CEO of Radiant Law and author of Sign Here, the Enterprise Guide to Closing Contracts Quickly. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you, Richard. Great to be here.
So, Alex, we've known each other a little while. You've come to not only run Radiant Law, but also be a leading voice in contracting generally. What got you into all of this?
Well, I used to be a real lawyer, as I like to say, and I think I fell into law and I kind of didn't really know what to do at university, and then didn't know what to do myself post-university. So I found myself in law and fell in love with deals. So I've been doing contracts since the very beginning, and I think it'd be fair to describe myself as a deal junkie back in the day. So I set up Radiant in 2011 as specializing in contracts. That's all we do. And I think I set up Radiant. One of the reasons was I felt that we were doing contracts really badly, and I think I may have been part of the problem in my youth. What was really occurred to me was that we spend so much time beating up the other side and beating each other up when we're actually trying to create relationships. And I felt that the incentives in law were all wrong with, private practice, with the billable hour and so on. And that we had to kind of rethink how we were doing contracting, but also rethink the incentives we were operating under, hence fixed price from the beginning, no timesheets and all the rest of it. So it's a long-term interest in contracts. And I think it's only deepened as you think more and more about, it's all about the relationship. It's not about, the contract per se. So how can we create great relationships, which is the purpose of Radiant.
Awesome. And just thinking back to those kind of early days where you were seeing some of these problems, and I had some experiences that sounded similar myself. What was really the crux of it? You mentioned kind of these win-lose type situations, broken relationships. What were the kinds of things that you were seeing that made you go on to found an organization who was going to do things differently?
Well, I think I made my previous answer being a little bit harsh on the environment I came out of, because I had an interesting experience of going to join an American firm called Shaw Pittman, which I joined in 1999. It's a few years qualified. And the first thing they handed me when I walked in the door was a dictionary of technical IT terms and a book by Cisco on how networks work. Right? That was like kind of the introduction. This is not normal. And this was one of the two firms that really figured out how to do outsourcing. And so I was going there to learn, I really learned my trade. And from the very beginning, it was all about what matters is the services, service levels, pricing. It's the commercials that matter, not the legal terms. But in practice, what we spent far too much of our time arguing over was indemnities and caps on liability and so on. And my sense was that the industry as a whole, that firm was unusual, and went on to Latham and helped set up outsourcing there, and we were doing the same thing, with much more focus on it. But that was still the exception, not the rule. And the complexity that was being created was not always required. But I felt the billable hour was really getting in the way of getting people to focus on what actually matters. So it's kind of evolving story here, but. It's just become clearer and clearer as we've had more and more data and experimented and so on, that there are better ways of doing contracting, better ways of creating relationships.
And going back to this kind of lawyer-centric view of contracts, if I can call it that, which is lawyers saying basically, this is all about us, and it's these technical legal provisions that matter. We know that that's not really the case, and contracts have a lot to do with commerce and economics and relationships, and actually, often not so much to do with law itself. Like where does that mindset and that perception come from in firms and in-house teams? Like what drives us lawyers to think, let's focus in on the liability provisions and give not so much attention to the key commercial things that really are the center of the agreement?
Well, I think there's a big question of why do lawyers do contracts, right? And I guess because contracts are ultimately supported by a legal system, so the lawyers monopolized it, but the lawyers brought their own magic of skepticism, and I think kind of characteristics, you say, of often finding seeking perfectionism, and kind of probably slightly academic and so on. So all of this meant that I think the whole topic of contracting, which I would say is not just also about the commercials and the economics and the relationship, it's all about the commercial economics and relationships. Means that we've got this gap between, I think, what lawyers think is a good job and what they think is quality, which is something which more often than not looks like, we basically stiff the other side with every possible risk, whether or not, we actually did or didn't do what we were meant to do, because that's a job well done. And the two problems with that, one is it means that we are sucking the oxygen out of the room, arguing about all the things that could go wrong and why the other side should always take carry the can for that. And therefore depriving us from having the opportunity of actually talking about the commercials and so on. And we've seen, the World CC publishes a survey every 2 years where it's an utter embarrassment to the industry, right? They say, what are the things that get negotiated? It's indemnities, liability, termination. What are the things that actually go wrong? People don't know what they're meant to be doing. So the result of this is that we are setting up relationships in an adversarial way which undermines it. I'm not saying don't have a robust conversation about how to make it work for everyone, right? But like I am saying that we're fighting the wrong points, and we're therefore making it not only are we damaging the relationship in that kind of warfare-like mentality of the negotiation, but we're also damaging the relationship because we're not spending the time which we should be spending thinking about how to actually make it work. Instead, we're just constantly dealing with risk, which is always, a threat, not an opportunity. And it's always something to be stuffed, given to someone else, as opposed to something to be managed thoughtfully. So we are increasing the risk and actually doing real world damage whilst thinking we're doing a brilliant job. And I think we can do better. Right? And I think, in the business world generally, you'll certainly find people who are like, I love my lawyer, they're always there in my corner fighting the good fight, right? But I think a lot of people look on with mild horror. But the magic we've done as lawyers is we've persuaded everyone that A, this is really a legal topic, and B, it's too complicated for you to understand. And we've reinforced that with these ridiculously long, turgid contracts that raise a ton of issues, right? So we have this ridiculous dance of, unreasonable positions begetting unreasonable positions, and then everyone makes a lot of money, except for the parties, fighting it out. That doesn't seem right.
And it's something we see. I mean, we see this every day, right? So the curious thing about Juro is the majority of our users aren't lawyers. So they're people in teams in a business who need contracts. And often when they come to us, they'll say, well, legal is the bottleneck. So, we have this commercial contracting process, and there's often a blame of legal. And legal is usually a bit kind of beaten up by that point and feeling a bit on the back foot and feeling like they're not necessarily adding value. And they come to us and say, well, we need new technology. And we often say, well, it may not be the technology that is the problem. Like where do these broken relationships within businesses stem from?
Well, I think everyone feels aggrieved, right? And you go and talk to the legal teams and they'll be like, well, they can't tell us what they need and they're not focusing on it. And we're having to fill in the gaps because they can't write anything down and blah, blah. So there'll be tons of complaints everywhere. And I think also we need to recognize that a lot of these behaviors are driven by fear, and those fears are not unreasonable, right? And the fear is fundamentally being blamed later. Right. So the legal team is often feeling that the organization will not back them if the agreement doesn't completely cover them in every circumstance, however unreasonable and so on. They're like, why didn't you, this? Like, well, why didn't you deliver? So I think we need to declare a truce, and rather than pointing fingers at any one particular, department and so on, because frankly, we see, we see it all because we work within large organizations doing it. We see all the different parts of the play. And I think there are lots of things that can be done to improve it everywhere. But the starting point for me is a grown-up conversation, and it's not just within legal, but within legal and the business, around the implications of delay and the cost of delay and the cost of this kind of the result on the relationship of these kind of behaviors, right? Versus, are we really trying to squash all possible risk, i.e. stick it on the other side, who are also trying to squash all risk and stick it on you? And so therefore, the conversation is basically, we're going to draw a truce around going after every single point that we could possibly think of and focus on, the things that really matter in the commercials, in the broad sense of commercials. And we're going to have shorter, clearer, more reasonable contracts. And we're going to look at each other and say, maybe there will be situations in the future where we're not covered in every situation where we fail to deliver, right? Yeah. And that, I think, is the starting point to a better solution for everyone. Because there is a real cost, and we know there's a real cost because, for example, there's an example in the book I talk about regularly at conferences, where we found that one clause in a negotiation made the deal 4.5 times longer to close. And the person asking for that clause was very reasonably just trying to make sure they weren't shouted out in the future. But it also turned out that a whole bunch of analysis we did, the clause didn't really have any value because no one does any data-centric kind of thinking here and so on. And that's why, I kind of ended up writing the book and so on about reasonable, automated, data-driven, incremental rather than transformational change, collaborative and so on, radical contracting. Because I think there is a better way, but I think it's a cross-departmental conversation that starts it.
And in the book and in the work you're doing, you're doing this in a radically different way. But in the market as a whole, for the duration of the time you've been doing this, have things got better in the market, or stayed the same roughly, or are things in fact getting worse?
It's pretty much stayed the same, right? I don't think it's got wildly better. I think people still struggle to find their contracts, right? Despite your best efforts to give them a place to keep it, right? I think generally speaking, we failed to use a lot of the basic technology that is out there. I don't think I've seen a significant change in reasonableness on positions. And it feels still quite lonely, fighting the good fight for short, clear, reasonable, relevant terms and so on. And we're getting there with clients. Not that we haven't taken clients on this journey and shown the results from it. But I think that's the exception, not the norm. Yeah. Unfortunately. It's taking a long time.
and for folks listening, I mean, what kinds of things does Radiant do differently? What kind of day to day? How do you fight that fight?
Well, so we're a bit weird, I think is fair to say.
Often have weird people on this podcast.
There you go. And so we get kind of pigeonholed as you're an ALSP or NewLaw or whatever the term is that you're used right now. But I think we are a little bit different. So we work for typically quite large or fast-growing companies who have lots of contracts, and they need help in the day-to-day, knockabout, repeatable deals so that they're overly stretched in-house teams can focus on the bigger, more complicated deals, knowing that it'll just be done. We're fixed price only and no timesheets. And I think that's significant, not only because, I think that's a better way of buying support, but also it's taken us down a pathway where, we've built a lot of tech and taken processes seriously and, done a lot of work with kind of disciplines like lean, meaning that, we turn contracts in half a day, right? I don't think anyone else is consistently turning contracts in half a day, internal or external. And that's kind of normal for us. So that's kind of one example is different, but we're also built around continuous improvement. If you've got real skin in the game and we're also trying to get rid of how many times we have to touch a contract or how long the negotiations take and so on. It's led us to on a whole journey of figuring out how to do things in better ways, which is kind of, I explain a lot of them in the book. But like, making it real has been an interesting challenge. But, progress has been made. It just always feels like we've barely scratched the surface on what's possible.
But it's such a compelling value proposition where, as lawyers, we often go and you say, well, we're going to sort of, help you control risk. And that usually means, you send to external counsel, you get a very heavy markup of everything they can think of. They don't necessarily understand your business, and it usually takes a long time. But if the pitch is, a half-day turnaround, really is you're getting a shorter sales cycle, which from a business value perspective,
Yeah, you do get a shorter sales cycle, but it's 100%. But it's interesting is that if it goes back from the other side's not doing it in half a day, or the escalation's not being dealt with in half a day, then you then start focusing a lot more on how many times you go through the cycle to get to close the deal. So what we call touches, and we're averaging, I think, about 5.3 touches a deal, which is far too many. So the question then becomes, how do you get rid of touches? And if the game is time to close, because the value comes from the relationship, not the contract. So we want to get the relationship going, but we don't want to give the farm away. So you've got to do it in a reliable way. Then I really believe the closest we have to a silver bullet in the industry, and I've generally argued that there is no silver bullet, but the closest I think we have is short, clear, reasonable, relevant contracts, right? Which is very prosaic, but it has an incredible effect because, typically we're operating, negotiating against in-house teams on the other side. We know if it's like a law firm, it'll take 5 times longer, but generally with these deals, you're not seeing law firms and incentives, and so, if they're taking typically 2 to 4 weeks to turn a contract, right, not half a day, then you just got to get rid of those extra rounds. And that lawyer on the other side really wants to be able to pick up a set of terms and go, this one's okay, right? So the simple test is, are you sending out terms that you would accept without any change, right? Because it's so middle of the road that it's like, whatever, right? And then you're in a really good situation because you want to create these relationships. Either you're buying or selling, but you want the cash in the bank or the agility that comes from using that supplier or whatever it is that will give you real business value.
And it's interesting, isn't it? There's sort of the difference between the outcome of the work and then the work itself. Because if you focus on the work itself, the lawyer sees a reasonable contract and goes, well, I need to prove my worth, therefore I'll make a point. I can't just say this is fine, but in fact, the outcome may actually be perfectly good.
Yeah, I mean, our test on like refining the terms is that the changes that are being made by the other side are random, right? So the lawyer on the other side is going to get their crayons out and mark it up, right? If they're marking up different parts of things and it's not the same points again and again, then you're into you're probably going, yep, someone's just trying to make a point.
Yes.
And then the question is, can you deal with them in such a way that the deal can get closed on the next round? It is hard to do in practice because you're back to that fear thing, right? Which is, we work with all these kind of fabulous companies and so on, but the people there are also still facing the question of, is it okay to send something out that's short, clear, reasonable, and relevant? Yes. And we found that like having a lot of data that we have, a lot of analysis and so on, that we are able to basically help them support their internal decision-making around how we can just get rid of these points because they're driving everyone crazy negotiating them.
It makes a ton of sense. Let's talk a little bit about technology. So things are fast moving in the world of contracts and contract automation, and there's a bit of a spectrum emerging, we think, between folks on one end of the
kind of fast. Saying, I mean, the conversation flits between topic to topic to topic. Yes. Whether anything actually happens underneath. I mean, obviously you have customers, right? It's not like people aren't doing anything, but like I do think there is a huge gap between the noise, Legal Geek or whatever, and the realities.
And things are it's totally true. And we've processed a couple of million contracts, and across those couple of million, you'll see some AI use and some no AI use, and some people using it every day in their workflow, and some people who will never engage with the AI parts of the solution. And I do agree there is an adoption gap in the market between perception and reality. But on that kind of spectrum, we see some folks saying this is never going to go anywhere. We see some folks saying kind of useful occasional co-pilots we now have to use for marking up contracts. And some people saying, in 2 years' time, agents are going to be autonomously negotiating contracts with other agents. I'm just curious, where you see things going and where you fall on the spectrum.
And when you say you were talking AI, right? Because it was like CLM last week, and before that, whatever it was, and so on. AI. Okay, so I have a bet. I have a bet with Casey Flaherty that I think it's a couple of years old now, that AI wouldn't have more than a 5% impact on the typical department in contracting, in terms of reducing the amount of time spent on it in 5 years, right? So that would put me on the skeptics end of the spectrum. And my argument is that on the drafting side, it's dangerous because you're trying to create consistency, and there's a well understood technology that does actually a better job there called document automation. That's 40-year-old tech that we do everything by document automation. It's why we're running at kind of this pace we run. It's not like we don't like tech. That on the negotiation side, I have a lot of concerns about basically new points. We're basically weaponizing lawyers to come up with more and more silly points to raise. And I think that the solution there is to be more purposeful in getting rid of negotiations on these kind of points, not necessarily just having more and more stuff. And I got to say that the demos I have seen have been quite startling for me, in the fact that it seems that a lot of the people selling AI stuff don't actually understand the content of what they're selling. And they're like demoing systems that are clearly just wrong. Right. And it's like, oh my God, well, if you make that change, that's going to be like another 2 weeks of discussion. Have we actually made this better? Right. So if we are doing things where we are very quickly producing dumb points that will create many weeks of negotiations, I'm not sure, maybe win on that front. And then you have the interpretation area, where I do think there'll be a ton of value in being able to reach into contracts and understand them better and so on, reason across your portfolio. And that's cool. And we're, doing a lot of stuff in that area. But my sense is that what we'll end up having is more questions about what's in the contract, and we'll spend more time looking at the contracts, which could be a good thing, but it's not going to actually reduce time, right? Because no one up to now has really been looking at contracts unless they really, really had to, because that's a horrific experience and no one could afford it, right? So it's not like there was a lot of time going on in that area. And, so I actually, that's why I'm actually, although... I use AI in tons of different ways, and we use AI in tons of different ways. I'm skeptical it's actually going to have a major impact on reducing the time. But there's a kind of a second question here, which is not just what's going to happen, but also what should happen, right? And so you were talking about agentic negotiations, and I'm concerned, frankly, because the purpose of contracting is to create a viable enough, simple enough, minimum viable kind of risk management structure, allow people to get on with it, with a relationship, right? That is, the point is the relationship. And relationships are between people, ultimately. Companies are a legal myth. And it is actually people who are going to make it work. So we can build systems where one system makes up a whole lot of random points and fires them across, and another system that deals with them in a semi-random way. And we go back and forth and something comes out. But I don't think we should be negotiating those points anyway. And the idea of excluding the people who are actually trying to create a relationship seems to me to be utterly misguided. So yes, we're going to see lots of people running around selling this stuff, but it's not the kind of the world that I want to be building, which is a more thoughtful human world that emphasizes creating great relationships and spending the time to really think about how to make it work, right? And doing deals that are more workable and more likely to be delivered, rather than machines just talking to each other.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's certainly consistent with our experience. I mean, if you look at, we have an AI extraction feature, which is basically doing contract analysis, which has nothing really to do with, agreeing a document. And we find, good adoption of that. I think where
just
we
making
have
sense of the world, and be nice if wrote clear
and actually generative
documents,
AI, quite good at it and getting better at it.
Yeah.
And, better than reading all your contracts manually. And I remember being a trainee doing due diligence and literally just reading stuff and filling out spreadsheets.
Right.
But it's interesting in the negotiation space, which is really kind of the kind of contract negotiation space being the core job to be done of those in-house lawyers, that I do have a similar feeling that often there's a optimizing a process that shouldn't exist type aspect to it. So
exactly,
start with a
my
contract.
hypothesis. Yeah, like my hypothesis, we're doing it badly, and a bunch of vendors are coming into the marketplace saying, "We'll make you do it badly faster."
Yes.
Right. And like, no, like this, we need to be more thoughtful and be thinking about the right topics rather than just learning as young lawyers, which we both did, right? Here are lots of points I can raise about indemnities, right? Well, good for you, right? But eventually you get over that stage in your career where you're just, enthusiastically finding problems, and instead going back and going, yeah, but it doesn't matter. No one's ever claimed under an indemnity, right? It's like, that's not the point. The point is this actually deliverable? Is this actually going to meet our needs? Is this actually, right? That's the real thing. Does this make sense, right? What happens if we don't, doesn't turn out that way? Not we sue, but like, how do we either make it likely to work and also deal with the consequence if it doesn't? That's thoughtful stuff, right? And like, by the way, what exactly is it you're buying and and selling and so on? Yeah. And that's where we're spending our time, right? But I think there's this kind of perception from those who come into the marketplace, fresh-faced and so on, and they rush up to Legal Geek, and that's fabulous and nice seeing them around. But of like, they're not quite sure whether to be super deferential to lawyers of going, obviously you're all wise and knowing, but we're just going to build you some tools that'll make your life a little bit easier. Or they also, one other group, or another point in the day, they're thinking all lawyers are idiots, right? I personally think, I love lawyers, and I am a lawyer, and although I kind of wish that we would do things a little bit more differently in a number of different ways, I think that actually that kind of keen analytical mind can be super helpful when pointed in the right direction of trying to make things work, as opposed to trying to find problems. And so I think there is a balancing act here, which says there's lots of value in which lawyers can add, lots of ways in which lawyers can add value. They can definitely be part of the solution. We need to create frameworks in which they operate, which allows them to be focused on the things that really matter. We are neither super deferential nor super dismissive of them. Somehow not losing the baby with the bathwater. And I think that's the path we need to find our way through.
Let's talk a little bit about the human beings that lawyers are, because this is a theme that comes across in your book, and also we've kind of talked a little bit about what is the role of a lawyer, and there's there's all kind of crazy things being talked about as to where the legal industry goes. But if we take the premise that there will be more automation, and it may not be negotiation, and it may be with certain caveats, what changes, if anything, about what it will mean to be a lawyer in 2 years' time, or 5 years' time, or 10 years' time?
Well, you talk to your average lawyer about, just getting the basics in place and so on. They'll give you a look of utterly harried and not a minute in the day spare, and everything is more for less. And, the surveys and so on show that, demand is going up and the resources aren't. So, all of this end of lawyer stuff, I don't know. I think that there will always be a role for experience and judgment call and seeing the point and so on. I think there will always be value for people who can help companies navigate an increasingly complex regulatory world and all the rest of it. So I don't think lawyers are all going to be disappear. And also you've got the classic Jevons paradox and so on, right? That, as you make it easier to deliver stuff, then suddenly demand shoots up and so everyone's busier. I just think that the more we can be doing purposeful work and not churning things in a way that's not necessarily actually helping our employers, would be good. It would be helpful. But yeah, I don't think automation means that lawyers disappear. So I think the world is so much more complicated than we imagine. That the ability to actually automate all of this stuff away is not my experience. What's happened, and we use a lot of automation.
But I mean, you work with a lot of, I'd like to say, forward-looking legal teams who are typically in large and fast-growing businesses. For those lawyers who are sitting there, crushed by low-value work and the whole more with less thing happening and struggling with commercial contracting, where should they look? Where should they start to turn that around, in your view?
Well, I wrote the book, sign here, The Enterprise Guide to Closing Contracts Quickly, edition 2, on Amazon. I wrote the book to try to give people a guide to how to work through it in a 3-stage process of, treating it as repeatable and standardizing stuff, applying the robots, right? And then, ongoing continuous improvement. So there's a guide and so on. So that's kind of one pathway, and I think everyone should be building those kind of skills and muscles and so on. So that's a good thing to do. People often turn to us because there's a lot to do in that area, and not everyone's got the time to specialize in it, and so we do it. The question then is, well, what does our team do? Well, I think there's a ton of more fulfilling work that can be done, which isn't being done. The more strategic deals, the more strategic work, and it's not being done right now because no one's got the time. So when is it going to be done, right? So we are a force multiplier and enabler of people to focus on that work. So talk to an ASB or do it yourself, either way, right? But at least please don't just keep going the way you are, because everyone's going to burn themselves out if nothing else. I mean, this is the pressure is getting worse and worse, and I don't think it's good for anyone.
Alex, thanks so much for joining us on Brief Encounters. Do, if you're listening, check out Radiant, and your book is, I'm assuming, available, Alex, from all good bookstores.
All good bookstores called Amazon, and also if you go to our website, we'll send you a free copy.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex.